Montana Territory, August 1876. The wind carried dust and trouble down the main street of Dry Creek just as the stagecoach rolled in, its wheels grinding against parched earth. Thomas O'Rourke stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, arms crossed, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had not planned on watching the stage today, but something had pulled him here. A feeling. A weight when the door swung open and a woman stepped down, dress wrinkled from travel, face pale but composed. He understood why. She looked like she did not belong here, too refined, too clean. Too hopeful, mail-order bride, he figured, and then she looked straight at him. "My name's Juliet Whitlow," she said to the driver as she took her trunk. Her voice was stronger than he expected. "I was sent for by Mr. Harmon Rourke." Thomas's jaw clenched. Harmon Rourke was no man to marry. He was a cattle rancher with too much land, too many hired guns, and not a shred of decency left in him. "Miss Whitlow," Thomas said, stepping forward before the driver could speak. "You might want to come with me," she turned, cautious. "And you are," Thomas O'Rourke, "Harmon's cousin." "Sheriff," her eyes flickered. "Is Harmon all right?" "No," Thomas said. "He is dead," she blinked. "Dead, 3 days ago, shot in a land dispute. I was going to send word, but—" He glanced at the battered coach. "Seems the message didn't beat you here." Juliet swallowed, clutching the handle of her carpet bag. "I see." She was trying not to let it show, but Thomas saw the shake in her hands, saw how she turned her face just a little, like she was gathering herself before anyone could see her fall apart. He respected that. "I will take you to the boarding house," he offered, already lifting her trunk. "You can rest there a night or two, then decide what you want to do." She hesitated, but nodded. "Thank you, Sheriff." The boarding house was quiet. Mrs. Keller gave Juliet a room and a plate of stew. By the time the sun dipped low, Thomas was back in his office, poring over land records. Harmon had left debts behind, big ones, and not just to the bank. Juliet showed up at the door just before dusk, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in front of her. "I do not want to leave," she said. Thomas looked up. "Miss Whitlow, I came here to make a life," she said, stepping inside. "Not just to marry a stranger. I had nothing back in Ohio. No family, no work. I sold everything to afford the passage. I am not going back." He leaned back in his chair. "You do not know this place. I can learn. You do not know what Harmon was mixed up in. I know he is dead, and I am still here." Thomas studied her. She was young, maybe 22, but there was grit in her voice, determination in her shoulders. "You planning on running cattle?" he asked. She smiled, faint but real. "I was planning on sewing curtains. I suppose I will pivot." He chuckled once. It surprised him. "All right," he said. "Then you need to know something." Juliet learned fast. Over the next few days, she kept to town, helping Mrs. Keller with laundry, stitching repairs for coins. But Thomas noticed how men looked at her, especially the ranch hands from the Rourke place, now leaderless and restless. Harmon had promised them land, wages. Now they blamed his death on the town, on Thomas, and on her. One afternoon, Juliet was walking back from the general store when two of those hands, Clayton and Madsen, stepped in her path. "You are the little bride, huh?" Clayton said, thumb hooked through his belt. "Shame you never got to your wedding night." Juliet's spine straightened. "Excuse me." Madsen stepped closer. "You staying here, sweetheart, or just trying to stir up trouble?" She stepped back, chin high. "Let me pass." They did not move. Thomas came from behind them. His voice was low and sharp. "Step away from her." Clayton turned. "Sheriff, I said move." They backed off, slow and angry. Thomas waited until they were gone, then looked at Juliet. "You all right?" She nodded stiffly. "I can handle men like that." "No," he said. "You should not have to." That night, Thomas sat on the edge of his cot in the back of the sheriff's office, looking at the fire. He had not let anyone in for a long time. Years, really, not since the war took his brother. Not since his wife and 2 little girls died from fever in Kansas. He had buried everything then. Moved west. Took the badge, swore he would never care again. Too much loss, too much grief. But now this woman had come, with her stubborn hope and her steady eyes, and something in him was shifting. He heard quiet footsteps. Juliet stood at the door, holding a folded blanket. "You left this at the house," she said. He took it, unsure what to say. She lingered. "You are kind," she said. "I know you do not want to be, but you are." He looked at her, really looked at her. "You do not know me." "I know enough." Her voice softened. "I know you saved me today," he swallowed. "I would do it again." Her eyes stayed on his. "I believe you." The next morning, things got worse. Clayton and Madsen showed up drunk, loud, and armed. They claimed Harmon had promised them the north pasture, and that Juliet's arrival meant she was laying claim to property that was rightfully theirs. Thomas told them to leave. They pulled guns. He moved faster. One shot rang out clean, sharp. Madsen went down with a bullet in the knee. Clayton dropped his weapon and ran. Juliet had been standing on the porch of the general store when it happened. She ran to Thomas afterward, her face pale. "You could have been killed." "So could you," he said. "That is why I need you to stay close for a while." She nodded, breathing hard. That night he brought her to his cabin outside town. It was small but solid. He had not let anyone in there since the funeral, not even himself, really. Juliet stood in the doorway, taking it in. The worn floorboards, the dust on the mantel. The two small wooden toys still sitting on the shelf untouched for 5 years. She did not ask questions. She just walked inside, set her bag down, and said, "You should let yourself live again." He stared at her. She stepped closer. "You are not the only one who lost something." He looked away. She put a hand on his chest. "Let me stay." He caught her hand, held it. His voice was rough. "I do not deserve you," she smiled, just barely. "That is not your choice to make." And for the first time in a long time, Thomas let himself feel something more than duty, more than grief. He let himself feel her. The first frost came early. By the time the aspens behind Thomas's cabin began to pale at the edges, Juliet had already hemmed new curtains for the windows and lined the pantry shelves with jars of pickled beets and beans she bartered for in town. She moved through the space as though it had always belonged to her, though she never assumed it did. Thomas watched her more than he spoke, not out of silence but study. Juliet didn't ask for affection. She stitched it into the seams of daily life: hot cornbread waiting on the hearth, a mended cuff set quietly beside his coat. She never reached for what he wasn't ready to give, but she didn't shy from being near him either. Late one morning, as Thomas was oiling the hinges on the barn door, Juliet came out holding a letter. "Came in from Livingston," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's from a woman named Ada Fisk. Says she boarded with Harmon once. Claims he owed her $70. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag. "Let me see that." She passed it to him. The handwriting was neat, but the words leaned heavy with desperation. Ada's husband had died in a slate collapse the previous winter. She wrote of 2 sons and no money for winter coal. "She won't get what Harmon owed her," Thomas said, folding the letter. "There's nothing left to pay with." Juliet took a slow breath. "There's a silver watch in the cedar box, the one with the crack in the face." He raised an eyebrow. "That's worth more than 70. "I know. But not to me." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll see it gets to her." As she turned to go, he said, "You always think of others first." She paused. "Not always. Just when I can't bear the thought of someone else going cold." Thomas walked the letter to the post himself that evening. The air bit sharper than it had the day before, and by the time he got back, he found Juliet sitting on the back steps, wrapping butter muslin around a stack of waxed paper parcels. "What's that?" he asked. "Soap. Mrs. Keller taught me how to render tallow from drippings. Thought I'd try selling some in town." He crouched beside her. "You don't need to earn your keep here." "I know," she said without looking at him. "But I want to." He picked up one of the bars, smelled it. "Sage and lye, juniper too, crushed the berries myself." He nodded. "You've got a good nose for it." A quiet settled between them. Not awkward, something closer to restful. The moon was just cresting over the ridge, casting light across the frost-washed grass. After a long pause, Juliet said, "I used to dream of a place like this. Not the land, exactly, but the stillness." Thomas shifted, resting his arms on his knees. "What did you have instead?" "A room above a tannery, Ohio River on one side, smoke on the other. My father was a cooper. After he passed, I did what I could. Hemming laundry. Folks weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either." "You leave anyone behind?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just the river." He leaned back, watching her in profile. "You've got strength in you, Juliet." She turned to meet his gaze. "So do you. You just keep it buried." His chest tightened. "Not from anger. from how plainly she saw him. The next few days passed in small, quiet efforts. Juliet sold 5 bars of soap and received her first silver coin, which she kept nestled in an old spice tin. Thomas helped repair a wheel axle for a family passing through, and in return they gifted him a sack of dried apples and a wool scarf stitched by their eldest daughter one morning. As Thomas was splitting kindling, Juliet came running from the cabin, a look of alarm on her face. "There's smoke north trail," she said, pointing past the ridge. He dropped the axe and followed her gaze. A thin thread of gray rose beyond the tree line, too far from any homestead to be a cooking fire. "Stay here," he said, reaching for his rifle. She grabbed his coat sleeve. "Take the scarf. You'll need it." He hesitated, then nodded, winding it once around his throat before mounting his horse and riding toward the smoke. He returned after dusk, smelling of ash and pine. Juliet met him on the porch. "Rourke's men?" she asked. He nodded. "They tried to torch the old trapper's shack." "No one inside, thank God. Sent word to the marshal in Miles City." She wrapped her arms around herself. "They're not letting go, are they?" "No," he said. "But neither am I." Inside, she brought him a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. As he washed the soot from his hands, she knelt beside him and said, "You can't do this alone." "I've been alone a long time." "You're not anymore." He looked down at her, her hands resting gently on his knees, her eyes steady on his. That night, he didn't sleep in the back room. He slept beside her, her hand resting over his heart, as if it had always belonged there. The first snow came silent and steady, laying a thin sheet over the pasture fence and softening the sound of hooves in the early morning dark. Thomas stood outside the barn, breath curling in front of him, the horses shifting restlessly in their stalls. He'd been up before dawn, uneasy from a dream he couldn't quite recall, just the sharp sense of being too late, of someone reaching for him through smoke. Inside the cabin, Juliet had already lit the stove. She didn't speak when he came in, just handed him a tin mug of chicory and sat beside the hearth, darning a hole in one of his socks. He watched her fingers move, quiet and sure. The fire caught gold in her hair, and for a moment he let himself believe this life might hold. "You ever think on what you'd do if you hadn't come here?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look up. "Sometimes, but not in the way you mean." "How's that?" "I think of it like a path I stepped off of. Not one I can walk again. I look ahead." She tied off the thread, bit it clean. "Do you?" He shook his head. "I don't look much either way." She set the sock aside. "Maybe you should." By midday, a rider came from town, Reverend Haskett, wrapped to the chin in a scarf too thin for the weather. He dismounted stiffly and handed Thomas a legal document, folded and sealed. "Judge Merrick sent this up. He's calling for a land hearing. The Rourke men filed claim against the homestead." Thomas read it twice, jaw tight. "They've got no right. They're arguing Harmon made a verbal agreement about succession. That Juliet's presence here complicates it." Juliet stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron. "What does it mean?" "It means they want the property under court review," Thomas said. "They think you're in the way." She nodded once. "Then I'll speak." "You won't stand alone in that room," Thomas said. Reverend Haskett cleared his throat. "The hearing's set for 5 days from now. You'll want to come prepared." After the Reverend rode off, Thomas brought Juliet inside and unrolled the map Harmon had kept in his desk drawer. He pointed to the markers scratched in near the southern boundary. Before Harmon died, he tried to carve up the land to keep his men loyal. "But he never filed the paperwork. It won't hold." Juliet leaned in. "And if the judge believes them, he won't. Not if we show you're the only one with rightful occupancy." "I've no deed," she said. "Only a letter and a trunk of clothes." "You've got more than that. You've got the work you've done here, the time you've stayed. You've got me." She held his gaze. "That going to be enough?" He reached for her hand. "It has to be." That evening, as the wind picked up and snow began to drift against the windows, Juliet took down her sewing basket and pulled free a strip of calico. She stitched a ribbon into a square of linen, then folded it into a pouch. "For luck," she said, handing it to him. "You'll carry it." He tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. "Everywhere." 4 days later, they rode into Dry Creek together. The town looked smaller under snow, the boardwalks swept clean, but the sky heavy with more to come. Juliet wore her best wool dress and gloves. Thomas had given her a pair his mother had made before the war. Inside the courthouse, the air was stale and cold. Judge Merrick sat behind the desk, spectacles perched low, a ledger open before him. Clayton stood to the side, arms folded, a forced calm on his face. Juliet didn't flinch. The hearing was brief. Clayton spoke of Harmon's promises, of the hours they'd spent working the land, of an intention spoken in the bunkhouse that the north pasture would be theirs. Thomas laid out the map, the lack of legal documents, the absence of any surviving will. Then Juliet stepped forward. She didn't look at Clayton, she looked at the judge. "I came to marry a man I'd never met," she said. "That man died. I stayed, not because of obligation. Because I saw a life worth building. I've sown into this place, not with claim or contract, but with my own hands. I've earned no riches, only a roof and a reason to wake up." The judge was quiet for a long moment, then he closed the ledger. "This court recognizes no legal claim by Mr. Clayton or his associates. The homestead remains undivided, case closed." Outside, the clouds broke just enough to let a shaft of light cut through the gray. Juliet stood beside Thomas on the boardwalk, the cold numbing her cheeks, but her eyes alive with something fierce. "You were right," she said. "It held." He looked down at her. "So did you." She took his hand, ungloved, and pressed it to her chest. "I want more than safety, Thomas," he swallowed. "You have it. I want a life with you. I want a home that belongs to us both." He brought his forehead to hers, breath warming the space between them. "Then let's build it." And in that quiet, snow-wrapped street, beneath the watching sky, they began. The woodpile behind the cabin had shrunk to a few armloads by the time February settled into the valley. Snow clung stubbornly to the hills, and the river beneath the ridge moved slow and thick beneath its icy skin. Thomas's shoulder ached from a fall he took chopping spruce near the tree line, and Juliet had insisted he rest it, though he still rose with the dawn, boots tied before the kettle even whistled. She'd started keeping records, a folded ledger tucked between two flour sacks in the pantry. Not just of soap sales or what they bartered, but of what they'd planted, what they'd used, what they'd need come spring. She didn't mention it aloud, but Thomas saw her thumbing through it most evenings, lip caught briefly between her teeth. Late one afternoon, with the sun drawing long shadows from the bare cottonwoods, Juliet stood beside the chicken coop, brushing hay from her skirt. "I've been thinking," she said, watching the hens scratch through the straw. "We could keep a few goats when the thaw comes. Milk, perhaps even some cheese." Thomas leaned against the fence rail, hand resting near the sling she'd sewn him that morning. "You planning to churn it yourself?" "I'll manage, Mrs. Keller says she can show me the press if I bring her some more soap bars." He nodded, then tilted his head slightly. "You always need to be doing something." She looked over at him, eyes steady. "Doing keeps me from dwelling." He studied her for a beat. "What is it you dwell on?" She turned back to the hens. "How easy it is to lose a thing before you ever get to hold it proper." The breeze shifted. A crow called from the ridge. Thomas didn't press. That night, while the fire snapped low in the grate, Thomas took down the old rifle from above the hearth, not to clean it, but to check the spring in the lever. Juliet watched from the table, where she was piecing together remnants of calico into a crib quilt she hadn't spoken of yet. "You thinking of leaving the badge?" she asked, not unkindly. He looked up. "That a suggestion?" "No, just wondering if you think there's still a use for it now that they've gone quiet." "They won't stay quiet forever," he said. She folded a corner of the quilt, pressed it flat with her palm. "But maybe long enough to build something." He set the rifle down. "Never gave myself much time to imagine that." Juliet met his eyes. "Then start now." The next morning, they rode to the eastern edge of the property, where the land sloped gentle toward a stream that rarely froze. Thomas pointed to a narrow patch where the ice had cracked and water ran thin between the stones. "Good spot for a springhouse," he said. "If we dig down and lay fieldstone, it'll keep anything cool through summer." Juliet dismounted and knelt, running her glove along the brittle grass. "We'll need mortar and sand." "I can haul it from the ravine by the railroad cut." She stood. "I'll help dig the trench." He raised a brow. "You'll freeze your hands." "I'll wear the oilcloth gloves." And you'll make us tea when we're done." His breath fogged between them as he smiled, slow and genuine. "Deal." By the end of the week, they'd cleared the brush and set the first stones. Juliet's hands were raw beneath the gloves, but she didn't complain. Thomas built a small lean-to nearby for tools, and one evening he caught her sketching the layout on a scrap of brown paper, tongue pressed to her back teeth in concentration. "You've got plans," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up. "If we keep the goats near the west fence, we'll have room for a smokehouse here." "You drawing the whole homestead now, I'm drawing the life I want," she said, folding the paper. "And I want it with you." He stepped closer, took her face in his hands, rough palms against her wind-chapped cheeks. "You've got it," he said. She leaned into his touch. "Then promise me something, anything, when the thaw comes and the first crocus breaks through. Don't just marry me in your heart. Marry me for real, under sky and stone," he nodded, voice low. "I'll carve your name into the beam above the door." "And mine right beside it," she smiled, soft and sure. Then spring can't come fast enough, and when the last snow melted, it would find them ready. The last of the snow gave way in patches, sinking into the earth and turning wagon ruts to deep, dark seams of mud. The cottonwoods along the creek wore tight green buds, and the wind carried the scent of wet bark and thawed grass. Thomas stood in the barn doorway, watching sunlight stretch across the pasture fence, his coat open for the first time in months. A pair of doves fluttered from the rafters above him, startled, and he didn't flinch. Juliet was in the garden plot, sleeves pushed to her elbows, pressing a line of onion sets into the loosened soil. Her hair was braided back, a wide straw hat shading her face. Thomas had made her that hat from willow and old feed sack twine. She'd laughed when she first put it on, called it crooked. Now she wore it every day. He stepped down the path toward her. "I saw the first crocus," he said. "By the stream bend, just one. Purple as bruised dusk." She looked up, dirt on her cheekbone, eyes bright. "Then we're right on time." They married beneath the cottonwoods, with Reverend Haskett standing between two fence rails and a length of blue calico pinned as a backdrop. Mrs. Keller brought a basket of molasses biscuits, and the McCraes came with pickled carrots and a fiddle. Thomas wore a clean shirt Juliet had pressed the night before, and she wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin sent east by her cousin in Cincinnati, whom she hadn't seen since childhood but who'd remembered her with a bolt of fabric and a careful note. As the breeze stirred the trees, Thomas took both of her hands. "I've seen the worst of men," he said, "and I've tried to keep the world at a distance because of it, but you came here and made space for hope again. You never asked for a thing you didn't offer in return. I didn't know I needed you until you were already part of everything I hold." Juliet's voice didn't tremble. "I came here with no name worth speaking and no place to return to. You gave me something I didn't expect: a man who listens when I speak and stays when it's quiet. I never thought safety could feel like a hand on my back or a roof I helped build, but it does, and I want nothing more than this life with you." They exchanged rings, a pair of narrow bands hammered from the silver of an old coin Thomas had carried since the war. Juliet had filed the edges smooth herself and etched a single line on his, like the ridge behind their cabin. When the day softened into twilight, the guests went home in twos and threes, and Thomas and Juliet remained beneath the trees. He helped her gather the scraps of cloth and ribbon, and she tucked the folded calico into her apron pocket. At the cabin, the fire was already laid. He lit it while she pulled the curtains closed and set her hat gently on the peg by the door. They didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. The language between them had become quiet glances, the angle of a touch, the way breath slowed when the other entered the room. When Thomas reached for her, it wasn't with hesitation but certainty, and when she stepped into his arms, she did so with her whole self. That spring, the goats arrived 2 dozen and a kid, traded for wool and a bushel of dried apples. Juliet named them after flowers. Thomas built a low pen with a draw gate, and Juliet taught them to take grain from her palm. She spent the mornings churning milk, and the evenings reading aloud from a book Thomas had found in the general store's lost crate, her fingers tracing the worn spine as she spoke. By midsummer, The garden had taken root. Beans climbed the trellis Thomas made from saplings, and the squat squash leaves shaded the soil. They preserved in batches, filling shelves with jars until Juliet began writing labels in tidy script June peas and early rhubarb and first summer together. One warm Sunday, Juliet took a bundle of linens to the creek to wash, and Thomas joined her, carrying a basket filled with bread and cheese. They ate beside the water, legs stretched out, the sun warming the backs of their hands. When Juliet leaned against him, he rested his chin atop her head. "You ever think we'd get this?" she asked. "I didn't think I'd get anything past the war," he said. "But you," he ran his thumb along her forearm, "you gave me the rest of my life." She smiled, not wide but deep. "Then let's use every day of it right." They built a smokehouse behind the springhouse, and in the fall they dried venison and smoked trout over green alder. Juliet sold her soaps in bundles now, packed in muslin and twine, and Thomas stopped wearing the badge. Sheriff Whitcomb from Miles City took over jurisdiction, and Thomas became just Thomas' husband, builder, homesteader, no longer a man with a gun always within reach. On the first frost of their second year, Juliet stood on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders. Thomas joined her, mug in hand, and they watched the mist settle over the pasture. She turned to him, eyes soft. "There's a child coming," she said. He didn't speak at first. Just stepped close and placed his hand over hers. "A good life," he said. "That's what we'll give them." And they did. They taught the child to read by firelight and later to ride along the fence line. They grew old with quiet hands and steady hearts. And every spring, when the crocus bloomed by the stream, Thomas carved a new mark into the beam above the door, not out of habit, but gratitude. Their cabin stood firm through every storm, not because it was built from stone and timber, but because it was built on the simple, unspoken vow they made beneath cottonwoods. To love without fear, to stay without question, and to live every day as if it had been chosen together.